This talk will describe the impact that animal agriculture has on our planet. In particular, the planetary boundaries that sustain life on Earth. Until recently, I worked with a team of scientists mapping deforestation in Queensland, Australia. Over 30 years of satellite monitoring, we witnessed 1,000 hectares of forest destroyed each day. That's nearly 2 acres of forest cleared every minute for beef and sheep production. 2 acres every minute. It's truly breathtaking when you see it up close. They used 2 50 to 100 tonne bulldozers running flat out, hauling a chain between them. Each link in the chain is more than you can lift, and trees 20 metres tall are literally ripped out of the ground and come smashing down, complete with any wildlife that happens to live there. They call it tree pulling, and it was invented in Australia and is now used with great effectiveness in southern Brazil's Cerrado. Each year, WWF reports on the global footprint. You may have heard that if we all lived like the average North American or Australian, we would need 5 planets to support our consumption. That means that future generations will not be able to live as we do. So what will change? Right now, the Earth needs 1.7 years to generate what we use in a year. That means we're consuming well past what is sustainable for the planet. The Stockholm Resilience Centre back in 2009 produced a major publication that pulled together dozens of scientists in different spheres to look at what are those systems that support life on Earth and how are we doing against their limits. They defined 9 planetary boundaries, and while 2 of them are still question marks, as you see there, the other 7 are increasingly well defined. So let's look at the ones in red first, the ones that we have most overstepped. Firstly, on the top left is genetic diversity. This is biodiversity loss. You may have heard that we're in the grips of the 6th great extinction. This is that. On the bottom, we see that nitrogen and phosphorus overuse well overstepped their planetary boundaries. But the others in yellow are climate change, land system change, which is deforestation, and fresh water use. What I'd like to draw your attention to is the black dots within each of those coloured zones. Now, the black dots represent those areas of the planetary boundaries that food consumption takes up. So agriculture is taking up the lion's share of each of those planetary boundaries. It actually takes more in climate change than what's notified there, but we'll have a look at that in a minute. And it's now being recognised that global food production is the single largest driver of environmental degradation and transgression of planetary boundaries. So first of all, I'd like to draw your attention to is how we use our planet. This is data from the last IPCC report in 2019. It looked at a huge number of studies to see how we use our planet. And if we start down the bottom, roads, transport, urban, suburban, even mining is in that 1%. So where we live is only 1% of the planet. The next section up in green is forestry. These are the forests that we use, plantation forests or logged native forests. The next section up is intact forest, which represents 9% of the planet now. Thank God. But the most important thing that this talk is about is above that blue line. The light green colour represents the world's grazing areas. Grazing areas produce, for us, red meat and some dairy. On the top left, in the cropland area, you'll see that about half the world's crops are devoted to feeding livestock. Staying in the cropland at the top, in the centre you see that biofuel and fibre, cotton. And on the top right, edged in green, you see those are the crops for humans. So you see that about 4% of the planet is devoted for crops that we eat. This here shows how we devastated the planet, number one, but it also shows the opportunity that we have to repurpose some of that planet. If you look at the top right cropping area for humans, that's 4% of the planet. If you look right of that, you'll see that that provides 88% of our food. And the area ringed in blue that we devote to animal agriculture provides just 12% of our food. And it's well known now that there's many papers coming out that are actually modelling the diets, in particular the vegan diet. A paper out of Oxford Uni a couple of years ago says that a vegan diet reduces land use by 3.1 billion hectares, about the area of Africa, by 76%. This study from North America looked at the diets, the North American diets. On the left-hand side is the average North American diet, which is rather meat heavy, and going down in percentage of meat. And then to the right-hand side, we see the vegetarian, and then the far right is vegan. You see that the average American requires 1 hectare to support their consumption, whereas for American vegans, they require less than 1/10 of that. Let's talk about deforestation. It's predicted that planetary boundary will be exceeded by 2025 to 2035. That is ecological collapse. What do we mean by that? Well, right now, we've deforested about 18% of the Amazon. And as you know, rainforests create their own rain. And it's predicted that when we hit 20% to 50% of the Amazon cleared, that rain cycle, that water cycle, will collapse, resulting in the whole of the Amazon reverting to open savanna. That's the ecological collapse that is on our doorstep. We're 18% deforestation now. By 20% we could reach that threshold. 130,000 kilometres of tropical forests are destroyed each year. The hotspot is South America, mostly Brazil, followed by Indonesia. And 1/5 of our carbon dioxide emissions come from deforestation. So what causes deforestation? We know that in South America, 84% of it is either for pasture or for livestock feed. They have a huge export market for soybeans and corn to Europe and to China. And Indonesia, the global number 2 hotspot, has been fingered for palm oil production. It's really hard to do studies in Indonesia because of the cloud cover, but this is the first study that I've seen. They've identified 23% of the deforestation is due to palm oil production and 20% for pasture. And the other 60-odd% is for mixed use. A lot of it would be for animal agriculture too. Note that palm oil produces 15% of its income in a product called palm kernel expeller, which is what's left after they take the oil out. And that is a common dairy feed. So logging does not kill forests, food kills forests. And how to kill forests is by fire. These are 2 10-day maps from NASA showing the fire in the dry season, northern and southern hemispheres. And you can see that the world is on fire. The hotspots are Africa and South America. But wherever agriculture competes with forests, that's where you see the fire. Also, you see fires where pasture maintenance is done, where they burn off the old dead grass to produce new grass for the following season. So what can we do? WorldWatch reported that we can switch from animal protein to plant protein. That will stop deforestation. Biodiversity loss. You may have heard that we're right in the grips of the 6th great extinction. And the language in the science journals is getting to be what some might call alarmist. They're saying things like this: humans are responsible. The 6th mass extinction is already here and the window for effective action is very short. Right now the species loss is 1,000 times faster than the background rate. And this is where the biodiversity loss hotspots are in red, and it's on all continents. So what's happening to wildlife? What is the impact so far? You see the top left of this diagram in blue. We see this is the biomass of mammals on Earth. Now that little rhino underneath the cow, that represents the biomass of all the wild animals. This is from mice up to elephants. And that biomass represents now just 4% of the mammal biomass on Earth. Next comes humans. We make up 36% of the biomass. And then comes our livestock, which makes up 60% of the biomass on Earth. So you can see how livestock have squeezed out the wildlife. Below that, you can see how 70% of the birds on Earth now are poultry. And the alarming fact now is that 68% of wildlife populations are now gone. Nearly 70% of the wildlife has been wiped out. What causes species loss is loss of habitat. And you can see from the diagram, the land use diagram we saw earlier, that the biggest impact we have is animal agriculture. That used to be wildlife habitat. It is no longer. So 80% of agricultural land is now devoted to livestock and feed. So meat is the biggest threat to wildlife. In 2010, the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency reported that the most effective means of reducing or stopping biodiversity loss, they looked at a range of measures, including doubling the areas of national parks, but the most effective measure was the no-meat diet, reverting grazing lands back to habitat. Protein pollution. This is nitrogen pollution. Reactive nitrogen is a wonderful thing, we all need it. Photosynthesis produces it in plants, and we get our proteins by eating those plants. But that reactive nitrogen, most of it returns to the environment as waste. And that nitrogen acidifies and eutrophies fresh water, that is, it reduces the oxygen level, and it's now considered the greatest coastal water polluter. So reactive nitrogen builds protein, but what happens with that protein is that any animal, including ourselves, when we eat the plant, most of the nitrogen, most of the protein is lost in our urine. Some of it remains in our body as protein. Now, if we then eat an animal that has eaten the plant, the same process happens again. And the worst example of the inefficiency of this system is when we eat beef. If we eat beef, just 4% of the protein that was devoured in that system remains in our bodies. The rest is excreted by the cow or excreted by us. So 96% of that nitrogen is returned to the environment as pollution. Here you see waste lagoons in piggeries. It's huge nitrogen loads. These types of scenes are becoming more common. When nitrogen enters water, the algae bloom. They just go nuts. And now there are 300 to 400 ocean dead zones from nitrogen pollution. How that works is this. The algae love the nitrogen, and with a bit of phosphorus, they explode in numbers. They rise to the surface and form that green scum. When they die, they sink to the bottom, and that process extracts all the oxygen out of the water. If the water has no oxygen, it's devoid of life. So hence the dead zone. And the red spots here represent those coastal ocean dead zones, largely from river mouths where nitrogen is pumped out to sea. But you can now see in blue areas lacking in oxygen. Those hypoxic areas are now in the open oceans and spreading. In the past, hypoxic oceans have been linked with mass extinctions. And how do we solve this problem of nitrogen pollution? Well, it's been most studied in Europe. And this is one of a number of studies that have looked at this and seen that we can halve nitrogen pollution if we halve meat intake, which will bring it to a manageable level. Land degradation and desertification. This is a map of global degradation. You can see that 69% of the land now is degraded. And within that, 25% is highly degraded. This is an example of the worst case of soil erosion. The sediment load from soil erosion, the greatest part of that is from gully erosion. And gully erosion occurs in mostly grazing lands where you have high water flows. At the moment, we're losing 20,000 square kilometres each year to soil erosion. And now we have 4 million square kilometres of cropland abandoned. It's estimated that half of the world's soils are gone, and that we only have 60 years of farming left if soil degradation continues at this pace. In other words, if we continue to farm the way we do now, we only have 60 years of cropping left. This means that we must change to agroecological or organic ways of production. The cause is deforestation, agricultural practices, and that of course is linked to animal agriculture. Fresh water. By 2030, the world will need 40% more water if trends continue. Right now, over half the world's largest aquifers are threatened. This is a map of water stress, water shortage up to the end of the century. And where does that water go? Well, 70% of it is for irrigation, and that's more, up to 90% in developing countries. But the impact of water shortages is seen in refugees. Those countries that don't have a strong support system for their farmers, if you have drought after drought after drought, as we're seeing now, those people who can't feed themselves or their families, what do? They get up and walk. On average, we have more than 20 million climate refugees per year since 2008. So what uses the water? You can see up the top here, a burger takes 2,400 litres to produce, whereas a potato at the bottom takes 25 litres to produce. On average, we need 6 times more water to grow a kilogram of protein from animal sources than we do plant sources. The Stockholm International Water Institute produced a report in 2012 that looked at this and said, how are we going to fare for water consumption by 2050? And we see that we can only produce enough food for the planet by 2050 if animal food consumption is reduced to 5% of total calories. That equals a 75% reduction of animal foods. Now that is a global average. So if you look at the meat consumption in those meat-heavy countries like North America and Australia, that means more than 90% reduction of animal foods is required. The oceans. Overfishing has wiped out 90% of big fish in the oceans. The fish we eat, we've wiped them out. And bottom trawling has ploughed the continental shelves. It's an ecosystem tragedy. Since 1950, the fishing fleet has increased 10 times and the catch has gone down by half. We now have 3 times more fishing capacity than we have fish to fish. And a lot of that fishing capacity was subsidised. Climate. We know now that half the major extreme weather events are climate boosted. We're reaching tipping points. Most of them are regional tipping points, but a tipping point is where we see abrupt, irreversible change. And we're reaching those points now. We spoke about this before. Refugees from climate is the big problem. This creates conflict between nations. The bottom left picture you see there is the border between India and Bangladesh. This is a particular flashpoint because of the droughts and floods in Bangladesh. They're being hit hard. Some of us haven't changed our way of life at all. Most in the Western nations haven't changed, except if you're in those areas that are burned or have drought. But it will be impacting us more and more in the future. The solution to climate change is that we can draw down nearly all the fossil fuels that we've released in the atmosphere if we turn that 44% of our planet that is now devoted to animal agriculture, if we turn that back to native vegetation, we can draw down 300 to 500 gigatons of carbon dioxide by 2050 if we change to a vegan diet, and that's where we can sequester. In 2009, the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency looked at this and they modelled different ways of mitigating climate change, and they found that reverting pastures back to native vegetation was the lowest cost, the largest scale, most effective means of doing so. So what must our footprint be like for our children and their children to have a decent future on this planet? For us to reverse the biodiversity crisis, we must eat on the right hand of the scale, the vegan end. If we want enough water by 2050 to feed the population at that time, we must eat vegetarian. If we want to halt deforestation, similar, vegetarian. If we want to halve nitrogen pollution by 2050, that's a 50% meat cut. And if we want to reverse climate change, return pastures to vegetation and draw down decades of emissions, it's a no red meat diet. Thank you.